Hey, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here, and faster than a hobbit, running out of the Shire on our new adventure. The first season of The Rings of Power has already wrapped. I've seen it, so let's talk about it. So before we get into this, a couple things. First, this will be no spoilers, any details if you haven't watched all the way through, or you're still waiting to know if you want to take the plunge. And also, season reviews are always difficult. Just there's so much content other than like a movie. So I thought we'd just sort of break this down a little bit more, like broad brush of kind of big themes rather than getting into like the nitty gritty of the details. But this show is one that obviously, if you guys know me, love Tolkien, love Lord of the Rings. This is my most anticipated show, maybe of all time. I know I was looking forward to this, and it kind of came with almost impossibly lofty expectations. The books, probably the most, or some of the most beloved books ever written. Peter Jackson's film trilogy, one of the most acclaimed and beloved films ever made. And then on top of that, they slapped on the old label of the most expensive show ever made. So, no pressure, right, to get this thing right. A lot is hinging on this show, and I'd say overall, kind of despite these expectations and despite some flaws and some kind of maybe failure in some of the execution and the script writing here and there throughout throughout this season, I found season one to be just an immersive, compelling, and just highly satisfying return to Middle Earth. This thing feels like Tolkien to me, and I think kind of one of the questions that comes up with any sort of these adaptations is, whether or not this is faithful to the Lord of the Rings, if this is faithful to Tolkien. And obviously, I think how you answer that question depends a little bit on how you define your terms. If being faithful is kind of like to dramatize or visualize like a Middle Earth wiki of the Silmarillion and his legendarium and kind of follow to a T the details of the story Tolkien wrote, then this is going to disappoint you. And I get it. I understand why people could be disappointed. People that love these characters, love these stories, and they're not happening the very same way, and you can kind of feel let down. Personally, for me, I've just never had much trouble with adaptations or changes to the details of these sort of things. We've kind of gone through this with other works and Harry Potter and all these sort of things. But to me, kind of the thing I was the most worried about or hesitant or hopeful for this is just that it would capture sort of the spirit of Tolkien. And again, what that spirit is also subjective of how you sort of interpret or approach Tolkien. But at least to me, at least to this Tolkien-obsessed guy that I am, this show succeeded. This show did seem to capture what I sort of see as like the heart and the foundation of the stories Tolkien I was telling, and it felt like Middle Earth, kind of through and through, all throughout. It felt like you were in the world that he created. And I think maybe a big part of the spirit of Tolkien is the tone. Kind of capturing that kind of dark but optimistic, hopeful tone that the books have, and I think this show, at least to me, it succeeded in doing that, and it is kind of in a time where the fantasy genre is this sort of really dominated by dark and gritty and kind of more kind of realism and this kind of more moral ambiguity and anti-heroes and all that. And again, I eat that stuff up too. I enjoy that, but kind of a counterweight to a lot of what's out there right now, kind of more modern fantasy. Rings of Power is sort of a throwback. It is sort of unashamed to be just completely earnest and hopeful, and kind of like, I think, something like a Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon, that sort of the George Martin world, where it kind of emphasizes that there's sort of darkness within every person that's sort of waiting to break out, and if there's enough conflict or if you're pushed too hard. Rings of Power sort of shows the opposite of that. Not that there isn't darkness and that there isn't darkness inside, but it kind of shows that there's goodness. There's goodness in the world. There's goodness within people. Even sort of the villains have a bit more goodness in them than typically you might expect. And at least to me, again, I don't think all shows need to be like that. I don't think all fantasy needs to be like that. But it's refreshing to watch a show where characters and friendships trust each other, and there's tension, and they share what happened, and they forgive each other, and they hug each other, and it is. I watched the show with my family. There is something refreshing about just some of that kind of optimism and earnestness that I think is lost in some of the other fantasy shows. Visually, this show looks phenomenal, as would be expected with the budget. This thing better look phenomenal, and it does. This is easily one of the best looking television shows I think ever made. Again, it's the most expensive show. It should be one of the most. And I think a lot of the special effects and the sets and stuff and the costuming holds up against most of the theatrical movies I've seen this year is definitely on kind of that level. And just some of the shots and the scenes and the frames are just stunning, I think, and kind of almost have like a painting kind of aesthetic to them. And quick shout out to kind of the visuals are supplemented by just a phenomenal score by Bear McCreary. Definitely adds to the whole feel of this thing. And I think kind of outside of the kind of the ire of like the lower purists and the people that are upset that they're changing the text, kind of outside of that criticism, which again I think there's valid criticisms in there. Probably the most frequent criticism and kind of critique of the show that at least I've encountered is that the pacing is too slow. And kind of uneven, and I agree with that. I do think that that is sort of one of the areas where the show is still seems like it's trying to find its kind of its footing a little bit. On sort of how to pace this, how to balance just sort of this ensemble cast. And I do think a lot of the pacing and some of the things, the issues to this are a byproduct of such an ambitious scope to balance all these casts and all these different races in the world and have so much going on. That I think because of that, it can feel like the show lacks a bit of kind of consistent forward motion, and some of the scenes sort of lack, or the episodes lack as much energy as you would expect, even as kind of weighty, significant plot things are developing. It still kind of feels like nothing's happening or it's moving too slow just because of the pacing. And I think maybe a part of that, a part of why the show sometimes feels like it lacks the energy that it could have, is that there's kind of a tendency to over-rely on just sort of dialogue. This is a very talky show. There's a lot of kind of characters standing around and sharing their motivations and like talking about what's happening, rather than the show kind of showing you through the actions of the characters what their struggles are, what their ambitions are. A lot of the script and the writing in this kind of falls back on this characters telling you that, or at least telling another character and kind of vicariously telling you. And some I think of that kind of the irony of that is that it's maybe more consistent with Tolkien than even like the action-heavy, kind of bombastic like Peter Jackson's movies. Tolkien's books are exposition, talk-heavy. The Council of Elrond's like 60 pages of talking, and then the epic Battle of Helm's Deep is like a page and a half. He was more focused on some of the the dialogue and the world building. So I think some of the criticism is just sort of our changing taste. But I do think, especially going forward into a second season, in order to kind of engage more than just the people that sort of love the fantasy and the world building, this show definitely I think does need to get a little more action, a little more showing through actions and through deeds, rather than just having characters sort of explain it all to us. As far as content, kind of things on the surface to consider this thing, really not a whole lot in this. There's no profanity, there's no sexuality. Nothing really. I watched this show with my 2 7-year-old boys, and there's nothing that you need to like turn off the TV or skip ahead of, other than the violence. This show is maybe surprisingly violent. I think Tolkien's stories themselves are violent, and a lot of his writing was inspired by his experiences in World War, and and I think so. I don't necessarily think it was too violent, but it was maybe a little bit more bloody. I think some of the scenes, like where characters are kind of bleeding out, or the orc blood and stuff, maybe did push it a little bit too far, at least for my sensibilities. Although I do think that it did add a bit of weight and a bit of kind of seriousness. It's just like how visceral the battle and the scenes and kind of war is, and not quite as like floaty as maybe some of even like Peter Jackson's movies maybe made it seem. So this show is maybe more violent than the movies, but at least for me, the father of 2 7-year-olds, I don't think it was overly violent. As far as themes, kind of things going on like beneath the surface of this, again, this show, kind of like Tolkien's kind of rich books and the source material, there are tons of this deep, kind of weighty themes to work through, and I think the way that the show unpacks those, and sort of some of like the way that like the episodes rhyme or call back to things, or some of the visuals, the motifs that go throughout. Again, we can do a whole video just sort of breaking down those themes. So, and we don't have the time to do that now, but I did a couple that did sort of stand out. Maybe just things to watch for. I think maybe the main theme in this whole thing is kind of summarized or symbolized by one of the opening scenes in the first episode, where Galadriel and her brother Finrod are talking. He kind of uses this metaphor of a boat on the river and sort of, looking up to the light rather than kind of being pulled down to the darkness. And she kind of questions, like, how do you know, because the water reflects the light, and sometimes you think that that's the light, but it's really the darkness. And I think that whole metaphor, it gets woven throughout this whole show of kind of finding the light. As another character kind of says, find the light and the shadow won't find you. And this is a show where kind of all the characters are sort of in this kind of increasingly darkened world, and trying to find, how do you find the light in this? How do you kind of see the true light, the true good, even kind of through the reflection and the deceit and some of that, and kind of all the characters, like the stranger character. Kind of how do you kind of find goodness through all the evil? So that's definitely a big theme in this. I think another theme that gets woven throughout with almost all the characters is kind of legacies, and what do you do with the past. There's sort of two in one of the some of the early episodes, kind of two quotes that get kind of juxtaposed together. One with Rondil, the elf, says, the past is with us all. We can't escape our past, so we sort of need to deal with that in order to move forward. Where kind of later, Elendril says, the past is gone, let it die. And it's just sort of this tension between how much does the past influence us? Do we just move forward? Do we kind of deal with the past? And kind of all the characters deal with that. Galadriel and Halbrand kind of talk about, redeeming our bloodlines. What do we do with, all the evil behind us? And I think kind of on maybe more of like a communal level, Prince Durin, the dwarf, and then Nori, the Harfoot, kind of deal with kind of against the past, like the traditions of their people. Both of them kind of aspire to do more than sort of what they've always done, and kind of struggle against that, kind of the rules and what's established with their people. So again, I think there's lots through all this. And then even the Southlands aiding Morgoth in the beginning, does that make us evil, or have we grown beyond that, or is it sort of in our DNA? So definitely I think some themes there. Maybe the last theme, which again is completely consistent with just Tolkien's own writing, is just faith and providence. One of the quotes that I think was used in one of the trailers, but stands out, choose not the path of fear, but that of faith. And there's sort of this whole, kind of throughout this whole thing, there's an element of like that things don't happen by chance. I think Galadriel even says, our meeting was no chance meeting. There is sort of a sense that that there is kind of something sovereign going on, but it does deal with a bit of the fact that we can't always see that. I think even like there's a scene, I think maybe episode 7, where Galadriel and Theo basically have the classical philosophical problem of evil, saying, there is providence, but how do I accept that when my home seems like it's being ravaged and there's so much evil around me? So it's not as simplistic as sort of a good versus evil thing. It's sort of showing faith, even when you can't always see kind of the full design of it. So in the end, I was satisfied with this. Are there things that I think didn't work as well, or I wish would have been different? Of course, I think you can probably say that about most shows. I don't know if the fact that I'm such a diehard Tolkien guy, if that makes me like biased to hate this show or biased to just love the show despite any faults. All I know is I enjoyed this. I enjoyed watching this with my kids, watching with my wife. It did feel like the start of sort of a journey that I wanted to go on and be a part of, even if at times I wasn't maybe as invested as I could be. I typically don't kind of do like numbers. I think it's hard to boil it all down. But I maybe give this like a 7.5 or an 8 is sort of where I landed on this show. I'm definitely super excited for season 2. I like what they're doing. I'm glad, kind of feel relieved that they captured the spirit of Tolkien. And at least for me, some of the changes in the lore didn't bother me as much as it did some other people. But hey, love to have a conversation. Obviously, if you just hate the show and we can still share your opinions, but let's keep it civil. Let people like it, let people not like it. But if you want to talk about it, I'm always open to talking about Lord of the Rings. So let me know what you guys thought of the season, if you're excited for season 2, if there's things in season 1 that you enjoyed or didn't love. Love to have that conversation with you guys. If you haven't done so, I encourage you, subscribe to our channel, become a Collider. A lot of stuff coming up, movie reviews, TV reviews, live streams. I'd love to have you be a part of that. But thanks for watching, guys. Stay safe and continue to collide through World for Christ.